Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with Legum Doctors.
Mm.
Today we're going to be looking at LGBTQ plus rights in India. And we've got a lot of really interesting stuff to get into. I've been reading through a ton of legal cases, articles, even some historical stuff, just to really get a sense of, how far India has come in terms of legal protections, what the key rulings have been,
Mm.
and also where the gaps
Just
still are,
about right.
because even with all the progress that's been made, there's still work to be done.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is that this whole story, it goes way back.
Yeah.
It's not just a recent thing. Like if you look at pre-colonial India, you actually see a surprisingly diverse, set of terminologies and even acceptance for different gender identities and sexual orientation.
Oh, wow, really? See, that's something that I think a lot of people wouldn't know. Like when I think of ancient India, that's not exactly the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah. Right. It's kind of like a hidden history. But if you look at like ancient texts, for example, like the Mahabharata, there's this character Shikandi who's described as being born female but living as male. And it's not treated as something strange or taboo. It's just part of the story.
That's really interesting. So it's like they had this understanding of gender that was much more fluid than, what we might think of as traditional.
Exactly. And even the Kama Sutra, which, a lot of people just think of as
Uh,
an erotic text, it actually talks about this concept of the third nature, which refers to people who don't fit neatly into the male-female binary.
wow. Okay, so it's like they had a way of acknowledging and even categorizing gender diversity. That's pretty sophisticated for, ancient times.
And it's not just the text. You see it in art, too. Like those incredible temple carvings at Khajuraho. Some of them depict same-sex relationships pretty explicitly.
Oh, wow. I've seen pictures of those, but I never really thought about it in that context.
Yeah, and that really challenges this idea that acceptance of LGBTQ plus people is like a modern Western concept. It clearly had roots in India's own history long before colonialism.
Okay, so now I'm really curious if ancient India was
Yeah.
relatively accepting. How did things change so drastically?
Well, that's where British colonialism comes in the 19th century. They basically imposed their Victorian morality on India, and one of the key ways they did that was through the law, specifically Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which they introduced in 1860.
Section 377, that's the one that criminalized homosexuality, right?
Exactly. It basically made any sexual act against the order of nature illegal.
And that was a direct clash with India's own history of acceptance.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, even after India gained independence in 1947, Section 377 stayed on the books for decades.
So this colonial law really cast a long shadow.
It did, and it had a devastating impact on the LGBTQ plus community. They faced discrimination, harassment, just a constant fear of being prosecuted.
So it was a really dark period.
Yeah, but even in the face of that oppression, there are always people fighting back, challenging the law, and demanding recognition.
And eventually that fight led to some major legal victories, right?
Yes, but it was a long and winding road with a lot of setbacks along the way. Like one of the key early cases was the Naz Foundation case in 2009.
Okay, and what happened in that case?
Well, the Delhi High Court, in a landmark ruling, decriminalized consensual same-sex acts between adults.
Wow, so that must have been a huge moment for the LGBTQ plus community.
It was a sign that things were finally starting to change.
But I'm guessing the fight didn't end there.
You're right. Unfortunately, the legal landscape can be unpredictable. Just a couple of years later, in 2013, the Supreme Court actually overturned the Delhi High Court's decision in the Suresh Kumar Kushal case.
Oh, wow. So a step back after a step forward.
Exactly, and it was a huge blow to the movement.
So what happened? Why did the Supreme Court reverse course like that?
Well, they argued that it was up to the parliament, not the judiciary, to change the law.
So they were basically saying it's a legislative issue, not a judicial one.
Right, and that sparked a lot of debate and protests. But even during that difficult period, there were some glimmers of hope. Like in 2014, the Supreme Court in the National Legal Services Authority case recognized transgender people as the third gender.
Okay, so while there was this setback on one front, there was progress on another.
Yeah, and that recognition in National Legal Services Authority was really significant because it granted transgender individuals fundamental rights.
So it was a big step forward in terms of legal recognition of gender identity.
It was, but the fight to overturn Section 377 continued. And it all culminated in a truly historic moment, the Nafte Singh Johar case in 2018.
That's the case that finally struck down Section 377 for good, right?
Yes, after years of activism and legal battles, the Supreme Court finally ruled that Section 377 was unconstitutional.
Wow, what a victory that must have been.
It was a landmark moment. And what's really remarkable is that the court, in its ruling, acknowledge the historical wrongs that have been committed against the LGBTQ plus community. They even said that history owes an apologer.
That's powerful.
It was a really emotional moment for a lot of people. It felt like a huge weight had been lifted.
So decriminalization was a major turning point.
It was, but it was also just the beginning. Because even though homosexuality is no longer a crime, there is still a lot of legal and social challenges that LGBTQ plus people in India face.
Right, because equality goes beyond just not being criminalized.
Exactly, and that's what we'll be digging into in the rest of our deep dive today.
All right, so stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back after a short break.
You know, it's interesting to think about how the Naftej ruling really kind of opened the floodgates for all these other legal challenges and activism aimed at, securing even more rights for LGBTQ plus people.
Yeah, it's like that one domino that falls and then boom, a whole chain reaction.
Yeah.
So where did the focus shift after Navtej?
Well, one of the biggest things has been this whole battle for marriage equality. Because even though homosexuality is no longer criminalized, same-sex couples still can't legally get married in India.
Right, so it's like decriminalization was a huge step, but it doesn't automatically translate into full legal recognition.
Exactly, and that's where the fight is now. Like, people are arguing that denying same-sex couples the right to marry is a violation of their fundamental right to equality.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like, if the Constitution guarantees equality for all citizens, then why should sexual orientation be a barrier to marriage?
Right, and they're also making arguments about basic fairness, like LGBTQ plus people pay taxes, they contribute to society, they should have the same rights and protections as any other couple.
And what about the opposition? What are the arguments against marriage equality?
Well, a lot of it comes down to, deeply held beliefs. Some people argue that it goes against traditional values and religious teachings, and they worry about the impact it could have on things like family structures and inheritance laws.
So it's a pretty sensitive issue, obviously, with strong opinions on both sides.
It is, and it's currently being debated in the Supreme Court.
Wow, so this is a case that's unfolding right now.
It is, and the court's decision will have huge implications for LGBTQ plus rights in India.
So we'll have to keep an eye on that. But marriage equality isn't the only issue on the table, right?
No, there are a lot of other areas where legal reform is needed. Like, for example, adoption and guardianship rights for same-sex couples.
Right, because right now they're not allowed to jointly adopt children.
Exactly, and that's something that a lot of people are fighting to change because they argue that it's discriminatory and it harms children.
Especially considering the huge number of orphans in India.
It just doesn't make sense to deny children loving homes simply because of the sexual orientation of the parents.
So are there any legal challenges underway on the adoption front?
There are a bunch of petitions that have been filed in different courts, arguing that the current laws are unconstitutional.
So it seems like India is at a crossroads when it comes to LGBTQ plus rights. The Navtej ruling was a huge victory, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely. Decriminalization was just the first step.
So what else is on the horizon? What are some of the other areas where legal reform is needed?
Well, inheritance rights for same-sex partners is a big one, because right now there's a lot of legal ambiguity, which can create problems if one partner dies.
Right, because they don't have the same legal protections as married couples.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of surrogacy. Current laws prohibit single people and same-sex couples from having children through surrogacy.
Wow, so even though homosexuality is decriminalized, there are still all these laws that discriminate against LGBTQ plus people.
Yeah, and that's why legal reform is so important.
But it's not just about laws, right? Societal attitudes need to change too.
Absolutely, because even if you have all the right laws in place, if people still face discrimination and prejudice in their daily lives, then true equality is still a long way off.
So how do we address that? How do we change hearts and minds?
Well, I think education is a big part of it. We need to challenge stereotypes and promote understanding, starting from a young age.
Yeah, like comprehensive sex education in schools. That includes LGBTQ plus issues.
Exactly. And for adults, we need public awareness campaigns to help people understand the lived experiences of LGBTQ plus people.
And we need to create more inclusive spaces in workplaces, schools, healthcare settings, everywhere.
Because everyone deserves to feel safe and respected, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity.
Okay, so we've talked about the legal challenges and the importance of social change. But what about the day-to-day realities? What are some of the specific challenges that LGBTQ plus individuals still face in India?
Well, unfortunately, discrimination and prejudice haven't disappeared overnight. Many LGBTQ plus people still experience harassment, bullying, exclusion. in all sorts of settings.
Like, for instance?
Well, in the workplace, LGBTQ plus individuals might face difficulty getting hired or promoted, or they might be subjected to offensive jokes or comments.
That sounds awful.
It is, and it can create a really hostile work environment.
And what about in schools?
Bullying and harassment are still major problems for LGBTQ plus students, and the curriculum often ignores LGBTQ plus issues completely, which can make them feel invisible and marginalized.
It's heartbreaking to think about young people facing that kind of negativity.
It is, and it highlights the need for more inclusive education.
What about healthcare? Are there any specific challenges for LGBTQ plus people in accessing healthcare?
There are, unfortunately, there's still a lot of stigma surrounding LGBTQ plus issues within the healthcare system. And many LGBTQ plus people fear being judged or mistreated by healthcare providers.
So they might avoid seeking care altogether.
Exactly, which can have serious consequences for their health.
So it's not just about having access to healthcare. It's about feeling safe and comfortable enough to actually use it.
Right, and that requires training healthcare professionals to be more sensitive and understanding.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. And it's clear that the fight for LGBTQ plus rights in India is far from over.
It's a complex, multifaceted issue.
But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about inheritance rights for same-sex couples.
Oh, right, because same-sex marriage isn't recognized. Couples can run into problems when it comes to inheritance.
Like, what kind of problems?
While the existing inheritance laws are based on traditional notions of family, so they don't really protect the rights of same-sex partners,
What do you
it
mean?
means they could end up being disinherited or facing legal battles with their partner's family.
That sounds incredibly stressful and unfair.
It is, and it highlights the need for legal reform in this area.
So even though we've seen some progress, there are still a lot of gaps in the law that need to be addressed.
Definitely. And those gaps have real consequences for LGBTQ plus people's lives.
Okay, well, I think this is a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of important ground today.
We have, and I think it's clear that the fight for LGBTQ plus rights in India is an ongoing one.
But there's also a lot of hope.
There is. The Naftej ruling was a major turning point, and there are so many people working tirelessly to advance LGBTQ plus rights.
So we'll have to see what the future holds. But one thing's for sure, this is an issue that's not going away.
Absolutely, and it's an issue that deserves our attention and support.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you learned something new today. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Legum Doctors for more insightful discussions. Until next time. Okay, so we're back. And before the break, we were talking about some of the challenges that still remain for LGBTQ plus folks in India, even after, that huge victory with decriminalization.
Right, because it's like one step forward, but then you realize there's still a whole staircase to climb.
Exactly. So where do we even begin to tackle these remaining challenges?
Well, I think education is a good place to start. Like, you have to address the root of the problem, which is often just a lack of understanding
Yeah.
and a lot of misinformation and stereotypes about LGBTQ plus people.
Yeah, and it's crazy how those stereotypes can be so deeply ingrained.
They really are, and that's why it's so important to start early. Like, imagine if schools had comprehensive sex education programs that included discussions of, diverse sexual orientations and gender identities.
That would make a huge difference.
It would, because it normalizes it from a young age.
Right. It's not like this big, scary, taboo topic. It's just part of life, part of who we are.
Exactly, and I think that would help create a more accepting and inclusive society.
And it's not just about schools, right? We need to reach adults, too.
Absolutely. Like, public awareness campaigns can be really effective in terms of changing attitudes and promoting empathy.
Yeah, like imagine a powerful ad campaign or a documentary film. That really gets people thinking about these issues.
And it needs to reach everyone, not just people in big cities.
Right. We need to engage with communities in rural areas, talk to religious leaders, have conversations with families.
It's about breaking down those walls of silence and stigma.
Okay, so education and awareness are key. But we can't forget about the legal side of things.
Of course, we need laws that explicitly protect LGBTQ plus people from discrimination.
In every area of life.
Exactly. Employment, healthcare, housing, education, you name it.
And those laws need to be enforced.
Absolutely. There has to be a way to hold people accountable when they discriminate.
And we need to make sure the laws address the specific needs of transgender individuals.
Yes, like making it easier for them to change their legal documents to reflect their gender identity and ensuring they have access to appropriate health care.
Speaking of healthcare, what are some of the challenges that LGBTQ plus people face in accessing healthcare?
Well, unfortunately, there's still a lot of stigma within the healthcare system, and many LGBTQ plus people are afraid of being judged or mistreated by healthcare providers.
So they might just avoid going to the doctor altogether.
Exactly, and that can have serious consequences for their health.
Well, it's not just about having access. It's about feeling safe and comfortable enough to actually seek care.
Right, and that requires training healthcare professionals to be more sensitive and understanding.
To the unique needs of LGBTQ plus patients.
Exactly.
Throughout this deep dive, I've been really struck by the resilience of the LGBTQ plus community in India. Despite facing so much discrimination, they never gave up fighting for their rights.
It's truly inspiring.
And it shows that change is possible.
It does, but it takes a collective effort. We all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable society.
So what can our listeners do? How can they get involved and support LGBTQ plus rights?
Well, first and foremost, educate yourself. Learn about the issues. Challenge your own biases.
And don't be afraid to speak out against discrimination.
Yes, if you see something, say something. You can also support organizations that are working to advance LGBTQ plus rights.
Right. There's so many amazing groups out there doing incredible work.
And even small actions can make a difference.
Like just being an ally, being supportive of LGBTQ plus people in your life.
Every little bit helps.
Well said. So to wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a few thoughts. First of all, the fight for LGBTQ plus rights is a fight for human rights. It's about ensuring that everyone has the freedom to live authentically and love freely.
Couldn't agree more.
Second, progress takes time. There will be setbacks, there will be challenges. But we can't give up hope.
We have to keep pushing forward.
And finally, remember that change starts with each of us.
We can all make a difference.
So let's keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Legum Doctors for more insightful discussions.